Right, year 12, here we are. We're looking at this particular passage. It's from Act 1, Scene 3, so we know it's very early on in the play. I just want to remind you that you'll get 3 or 4 bullet points. They will be sharply focused on tragedy, the genre of tragedy. So in this case, we're looking at the presentation of Iago and Rodrigo. We're looking at the setting and action, and we're looking at other relevant aspects of dramatic tragedy. So that means we need to talk about things like the catastrophe, the peripeteia, hamartia, etc., and show knowledge of the tragic form, okay? Now, before we begin, it's always a very good idea to begin by showing that you know where this passage is from, okay? So I'm going to ask Ava straight away. Where's this passage from, Ava? What happened before it? The trial, exactly. So we need to refer to the fact that it is the court scene. Now, you will recall that most of you, even the drama students in this room, do not write enough about the drama and what the audience are experiencing. So remember that we are moving from the public scene of the trial, okay, to a private scene. And Shakespeare immediately introduces us to the many faces of Iago. Now, you will recall, Katie, that the play opened with Iago being incredibly insulting about Othello. What did he say?
He called him a black man.
Okay, so he focused on his race. And then you saw Iago with Othello. And how did he speak to him?
As if he was a friend.
As if he's a friend. And then we saw the court scene, didn't we? And what does Iago say at that? Trick question. He says nothing, doesn't he? Okay. So what we see is that Iago, we see him in the private sphere, don't we? He's silent in the public sphere. And what's interesting is after the court scene, where we see all the rhetoric of Othello and Desdemona and Brabantio, which is all the kind of high poetic rhetoric, we now have Iago. And you will notice straight away that Iago speaks differently, doesn't he? He's much closer to prose. He uses a lot of colloquial language. There are times when he rhymes, but here he speaks to Rodrigo, and it seems a lot more like something like we would call like street speak, don't you think? Now, what do we know about Rodrigo, Patricia? Is he a well-rounded character, or is he a recognizable character archetype?
He's very open with emotion, which Iago takes advantage of.
He is. In Shakespeare's day, they referred to him as a dolt, D-O-L-T, or a gull. Anyone want to give me a modern translation for that? Fool, a believer in everything, extremely gullible. So in many ways, we need to think about Rodrigo as a kind of clown-like character, don't we? He's a kind of foolish character. You could play him as a clown, and this is why many of Shakespeare's contemporaries were very angry with Shakespeare. Shakespeare would often inject elements of comedy into the play, and we see that on a number of times. In fact, later on, when we go to Cyprus, we will see that Cassio meets a real clown just before one of the most serious scenes, okay? Now, we see Iago speaking here, and this is classic Iago speech. Thou art sure of me. Go, make money. I have told thee often, and I retell thee again and again. I hate the Moor. What can we say about his speech straight away? Well, notice that it's orders and that it's a series of imperatives. He dominates Rodrigo, doesn't he? He gaslights him today, doesn't he? And he controls him in every conceivable way. Now, this is interesting because we saw Iago in the previous scene with Othello, and as Katie said, he was entirely dutiful, isn't he? So already the audience, Shakespeare gives us access to the duplicity of the audience, okay? In terms of putting a little bit of context there, we might want to use the term Machiavellian. Now, don't forget that an English audience would have heard of Machiavel, or at least the more educated members of it, and would have heard about this idea of appearances and manipulating people. And they would associate Catholic Italy with highly manipulative, hypocritical people who use masks. Okay. Now, what's so interesting here is we get into Iago's lexical choices. And these pattern throughout the play, don't they? He says here, let us be conjunctive in our revenge against him. Can you remember, Gracie, why does he want revenge against Othello, according to him in the opening scenes? One of the first things, apart from the racism that he talks about, is being passed over for promotion, isn't it? And he's absolutely insulted by that. He calls Cassio a Florentine, a mere arithmetician. Do you remember that? Which means you can only do things in theory. He says, mere prattle without practice. So he's just a talker. He's not a man of action. So he casts himself as a man of action, and he also casts himself as someone who has been unfairly treated, perhaps even in terms of social class, you will remember, okay? However, notice here, he is going to come up in a moment with a completely different idea of why he is vengeful. So one of the mysteries in terms of the revenge tragedy, guys, is usually a revenge tragedy has a very clear motive. Sasha, does he have a clear motive? Do you know what Iago's motive is? At the end of the play, when he's completely silent, can you honestly tell me you know why Iago did all of this? No. Now, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, and we'll do a lesson on him, so I won't say too much, talks about motive hunting. It's almost like Iago goes hunting for a motive, because he gives us so many different motives. But what's interesting here in terms of context is the money thing. Now, why do you think that money features so much in Iago? What do you think, Patricia? What do you think Shakespeare's frightened of in characters like Iago?
Them gaining power, so money is a symbol of having.
Absolutely. And don't forget, you all studied medieval times, didn't you? Here's the lord and here's the yeoman, and everybody knew their place in terms of the medieval hierarchy. But in Shakespeare's day, that is beginning to break down, and you have new self-made men. Now, I'm deliberately saying men there, girls. I'm not being sexist, I'm being historical, which is obviously women didn't ascend in the same way because it was a patriarchal society. So Iago is part of an archetype in Shakespeare of this ambitious, restless man. And in particular, he seems a greedy man, and money and possessions are part of his plot, aren't they? And he's essentially robbing Rodrigo, isn't he? Now, the scary thing is that it's possible to kind of like Iago. He has an energy. Now, as he's saying these things, he has a kind of charisma. Now, some of you will remember that Iago is often compared to the figure of Vice. And Vice was a popular figure in medieval mystery plays. Vice represented the dark side of humanity, a kind of satanic idea of humanity. But as you will see, Iago's also ingenious. And it's like he's rubbing his hands with pleasure when he talks about his sport and his pleasure. So I want you to look at the lexical choices that he uses. Sport and pleasure. This is almost fun to him. And he addresses the audience as though we are co-conspirators. Iago is always speaking to us directly. We enjoy a strange intimacy with him as the audience, okay? One of the things that makes Othello so disturbing as a tragedy, it's almost like we conspire with Iago against Othello, okay? Notice a pattern that happens in every dialogue between Iago and Rodrigo. Rodrigo says, "Where shall we meet in the morning?" Always he's looking for directions, asking questions. And this is why I say that he's gaslighted, you see. He simply asks questions. Now, what's interesting, class, many of you may not realize this, Rodrigo is of a much higher position than Iago. He, in fact, is a man of power. But Iago is able to manipulate him and turn him into this dolt, this gull, this absolute fool, isn't he? Now, I want somebody to tell me where we could link to later in the play. Anybody? Do we see this? Is this a pattern that reoccurs?
When Iago tells Othello of his ideas and what's happening in Desdemona, you can see Othello physically fall off the ground on his knees.
So Will says we could then see the same pattern later with Othello, and this shows how Othello becomes degraded from that original court scene where he's so majestic, isn't he, to a Rodrigo-like fool who's led by Othello, and that intensifies the tragedy. But arguably, we could say, Will, it also shows that Othello is not the only person who's duped. So Shakespeare is showing us the ingenuity of Iago, isn't he? And it's not simply, you know what I mean, the foolish black man other, is it? It is in fact Venetians who also tricked by him. So we could say that. Any other links that anyone could think of potentially, Patricia? Okay, when he tells him to kill Cassio, and how would you link that?
Basically, you can tell him what to do when you listen to it because you trust him.
Absolutely. So Rodrigo goes on to kill Cassio. He goes on to fight Cassio when Cassio is drunk. And finally, Patricia, you could even say that he manages to kill Rodrigo in the end. And Rodrigo doesn't suspect it, does he? Remember that? So right throughout, we can see that there is no progression whatsoever in Rodrigo's character. Clearly, Shakespeare does not intend us to empathize with him. Is he a tragic hero? No. In fact, he's a comic fool in many ways, isn't he? So in spite of the fact that arguably his fate is tragic in the end, we never see any elements of tragedy about him, do we? But we see this idea of complete control that Iago is able to establish at this particular phase. So we might say, mightn't we, that this is Shakespeare introducing us to the power and the ingenuity of Iago. Now there's one further thing that I want to ask Sasha about. Sash, we touched on the womb and on the idea of this birth and this idea of his plot as a birth. That is something that it goes throughout the play, don't you think? A pride in it. Sometimes he calls himself an artist, sometimes it's a birth, sometimes it's a trap. What would you say about that?
It's like from the sport, he sees it as a game.
He does see it as a game, but at other times he sees it as more serious than that, doesn't he? And here he sees it as a kind of child, his baby, which is really interesting, isn't it? Now, it might be of interest to you, we'll turn over now, because he says it again in the speech here, but it might be worth remembering that the Greek word author, did you know, means father, okay? So the idea of being a writer and an impregnator is there in the language itself. And that's why when we say prayers like the Lord's Prayer, we refer to God as author of my being, my creator. Now, how about this? That it's a kind of Frankenstein idea, isn't it? Do you remember when Frankenstein wants to kind of create a monster? He also wants to give birth and to reproduce. There's a kind of idea here of Iago setting himself up as a godlike creature, as a creator, and reveling in his power. Yes, Sasha?
Once Rodrigo was like Ephesus, and the other kind of switches to talk about how
Yes.
it links to in Act 1 to like appearing personality where Iago defines what I am.
I am not what I am. That's an excellent connection, isn't it?
And that makes me like, there's a Bible quote that says, I am what I am. This is like the antithesis of God. He has the same kind of powers as God.
He seems to have the powers of God. And look at this line here, Sasha. I am changed. Look at the colon. I'll go sell all my land. It's a composed line, isn't it? I am totally your man now. I am totally in your control. So the scene began with Rodrigo crying, I'm never going to have her. Blah, blah. And here it ends with him saying, I am changed. I'll go sell all my land. And it shows the command that Iago has over people. So what Shakespeare's doing here, guys, is he's setting up a pattern of showing us the excellence of Iago's manipulation. And that will prepare us. It's like a prelude to the real play, which will be the deception of Othello, won't it? Okay? And it kind of reminds us again, from a racial point of view, it goes away from the racist kind of views where some people called, like Thomas Rhymer called Othello a booby, a fool. I think Shakespeare isn't just racially singling Othello out. I think he's showing the vast powers of this terrifying antagonist. Okay. Now, Iago is then left alone, and we have a soliloquy. Now, this is extremely unusual. Gracie, tell me why. The soliloquy is a very, very important type of speech. What is it? It is, and it's usually the hero who gets the soliloquy, because it allows the soliloquy to verbalize their thoughts. In terms of, if it was like a novel, this would be a kind of stream of consciousness moment where I am going to reveal my thoughts to you. So Shakespeare gives most of the soliloquies to Iago, to the antagonist. And that's very unusual, really, because that means that a lot of the powerful speeches go to Iago, don't they? Okay? And notice the joyful tone. Thus do I ever make my fool my purse. Ha ha! You know, I'm going to manipulate him, get his cash. For I mine own gain knowledge should profane. If I would time expend with such a snipe, he shows his absolute contempt for him, but for my sport and profit. So again, there's a kind of wicked delight to this, which again is reminiscent of the vice-like character. Can anyone else tell me when Iago is rubbing his hands in the play with joy and glee? Anyone? No? Do you recall when he gets Othello so upset that Othello goes into a fit? Do you remember that? And then he dances around him with pleasure and joy, okay? So this notion that Iago delights in his plot and his creativity, that occurs throughout the play. It's a pattern that we look for. So then, Patricia, how does that relate to tragedy, though? It's all very well and good saying that, but how's it relevant to tragedy?
I think emphasises like downfall and like there's a bit more credibility.
It does, and it also gives, don't you think, Iago a kind of demonic, terrifying, character. This joy, etc., this love of destruction is kind of quite terrifying, isn't it? And I think one of the most powerful elements of Othello is the power of the antagonist, who is almost a superhuman character throughout much of the play, isn't he, okay? But here's the thing, class. This is what is so complex about Iago. We can't just say Iago's a vice-like character and that he's an archetype, like Rodrigo, because he seems to be very psychologically complex. Watch this. So he's saying here, but for my sport and my profit. Listen to the tone. Ha ha ha, I'm winning. But then listen to this. I hate the Moor, and then there's a colon there. This Sosora here shows that all of a sudden he stops. And look at the change here. And it is thought abroad that betwixt my sheets he's done my office. So to go from joy to insecurity and paranoia there is bizarre. There seems no indication in the play that this has any credibility. And that's why the very great critic Harold Bloom says that sexual insecurity lies at the base of Iago. Now that's one reading. It doesn't have to be the right reading. That's a very character-based reading. But Harold Bloom says he thinks that this line is really significant. So what is quite interesting is why that amazing reversal from triumph to paranoia all of a sudden? Well, it does show a certain instability in Iago, doesn't it? Basically saying, oh, Othello has had sex with my wife. And 'tis thought abroad, in fact, everybody knows. So again, it shows this kind of concern with reputation, doesn't it? Later, Iago is going to dismiss reputation. Do you remember? Virtue 'tis a fig, he says. Everything is appearance. Don't worry about reputation, he says to Cassio. But here he seems to be gnawed with insecurity that his wife has been slept with, okay? Now, I think that this is possibly the greatest speech in the play. I'm going to explain to you why. Don't forget, a good student talks about which bits are really valuable or exciting or dramatic. And this is extremely dramatic. And this is the genius of Shakespeare. I have never seen this anywhere else, okay? So he says here, I know not if this be true, but for mere suspicion, I will give it surety. I will make sure. He holds me well. The better shall my purpose work on him. Cassio's a proper man. Now watch this, guys. This is what we would call today stream of consciousness, okay? That means that we're going to follow his mind. And what is so ingenious about Iago's plot, as I said to you before, it's not really authored at all. He comes out with it in real time, and we, the audience, watch him do that. And that's what makes him so sinister and so superhuman in a way, because he says in double knavery, how? Look at the line in double knavery. There's a Sosora. How? Sosora. How? He asks himself. Let me see. What's the pause? The pause shows thinking. So he's working the plan out in real time before us. After some time to abuse Othello's ear, that he is too familiar with his wife. He has a person and a smooth dispose. And here we come to Iago's genius. His ability to identify human frailty. His ability in real time, spontaneously, to work out a plan based on people's hamasha, on their weaknesses and their errors. To be suspected, framed, to make woman false. The Moors are free of open nature. Look how rapidly the plan unfolds before our very eyes. You will notice that there is no iambic pentameter here. The lines are often broken because Shakespeare is writing in a new way here. I said to you before, much more like prose, isn't it? And he's writing like prose because he wants you to see the mind in operation, doesn't he? Now, if you ever use this term stream of consciousness, it's a modernist 20th century term. So you've got to use it with inverted commas, because Shakespeare didn't know about it. But there is a kind of stream of consciousness quality here, which is absolutely remarkable. And you will never see this in anyone else's work of the time, and you won't see this until modernism, I feel. Okay? So it's incredible. And one other thing we notice here about Iago's speech, that he says he's going to lead him by the nose as asses are. So a big pattern in his speech is zoomorphism, animalistic imagery, which he uses all the time. Who can give me a few examples of animalism? Yes, Patricia?
They call it Barbary horse.
A Barbary horse, okay. And a Barbary horse is known for being lustful and, you know, at risk of getting myself in trouble on recording, for having a big penis, okay, for breeding. So he tries to always animalize Othello, doesn't he, okay? Later, we will see that the animal imagery, the zoomorphism, moves into Othello's speech. Do you remember? So that's another link that you could make. Goats and monkeys, etc., says Othello later. He starts to sound like Iago, and his speech starts to be framed in the same way as Iago's speech, okay? And then he ends here. I have it. Look at the joy. So in this one speech, an enormous amount is done. Now the audience might be frightened of Iago, and they might have some sorrow for the tragic hero, but they're also complicit in his genius. And there is a certain admiration that we might have for him. And notice here, Aaron, monstrous birth. Is that important? It's part of a pattern that I want you to see in the play, in which he compares his plan, his plot, to a kind of pregnancy, an authoring, like I said, and he's going to give birth. Now, there's something horrifying about that. It's a bit like Rosemary's Baby, don't you think, or something like that. A kind of where you're going to give birth to a kind of satanic fetus, whatever, isn't it? And again, there's something pretty sinister about that, okay? So this is a great extract, and I hope that I was able to model for you how I want you not to write about the extract and then later about the play, but to weave in your knowledge of the play as you go along, okay?